Good morning, Lyme Land Trust. My name is Mike Zarfos. I'm here leading you on a virtual tour of the Ravine Trail. I'm a PhD candidate at SUNY ESF, that's the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, which is based up in Syracuse, New York. I study northern hardwood forests in the Adirondacks and the impacts of historic patterns of acid rain and beech bark disease on those communities. So I'm generally a plant guy, though my expertise is up in the Adirondacks. I grew up in Connecticut, so I know a lot of the plants here from my explorations of the backyard. It's May 30th, so our plants have leafed out fully in Connecticut, but we also have a number of plants that are starting to flower. So we're going to walk along this trail, check out some of its features, and identify some of the plants that are growing here and show you how to identify those when you're out on a nature walk. We found our first plant here right off the trail, so we haven't even gotten into the woods yet. And the cool thing is when you're hiking out in the woods is that there's a good chance you're going to find interesting plants near the trail or near the edge of the road. And that's because there's more light. One of the important limiting nutrients in the forest, or limiting energy sources in the forest, is light. But anyways, this is Parola. It's got these rounded leaves that are simple. They don't really have any teeth. It sends up a couple little stalks of flowers that will be white. They'll be kind of globose, and they're going to hang down a little bit once they come out in July and August. It's going to grow, its leaves are going to come out basally, so they're coming out of the base. They're not going to come up on a stalk. So this is a basal arrangement of leaves. So we're going to look at another plant here that was right next to our shin leaf, and which folks might confuse, or at least think of as looking similar to the shin leaf. And that's probably because it has evergreen leaves with pretty distinctive veins to it. So the shin leaf had these kind of distinctive veins, and this has really distinctive veins. What we've got here is Pipsissewa. I just can't do it. Pipsissewa, or striped wintergreen. So or princess pine. So there's several different common names, and they're all shared with other plants, which is a pain in the butt. So we found another great and very common plant in Connecticut understories, and I should say the plants we've looked at so far, the difference between them and the trees is that they're herbaceous plants, and herbaceous means that they senesce and disappear, they wither at the end of the season. So most of the plants in our understory in the forest are herbaceous plants, whereas our trees are woody. So they last all year round. They put a lot of investment into structures that allow them to get up into the canopy and monopolize the light. So this is a really common plant in the understories of Connecticut forests. It's called Canada mayflower. I believe the species name, and the genus might have changed recently, is Myanthemum canadense. And it's closely related to another plant that you may encounter and we may cover today, which is false Solomon seal, Myanthemum racemosa. So they have some characteristics in common, mostly the texture of their leaves, but the overall shape and structure of the plant is very different. So some cool things about Canada mayflower. One is that it's got two forms that you're likely to see on the forest floor. They're slightly heart-shaped, so they have two recurved lobes at the base of the leaf, which makes it somewhat heart-shaped. And then they have some prominent veins going from the base of the leaf to the tip of the leaf. And those veins are indented. The leaves, while they're herbaceous, they're not evergreen. They're pretty tough leaves. They're shiny. They look like they could withstand a decent amount of water loss. And it probably makes sense given the fact that this plant is only putting up one leaf generally for photosynthesis all year. It really needs to rely on that leaf, so it needs it to survive the various stresses of living out in the woods. What we're looking at here is a violet. I'm not sure which violet. These leaves are pretty interesting and distinctive. They're kind of an arrow shape and they're quite fuzzy, so I think if we were to try and key it out, we might even be able to get it on its vegetative qualities, the leaves. But in general, violets are very difficult to identify to species unless you have technical skills and a key and the ability to measure different parts of the flower. Most of them produce flowers that are very similar. They're bilaterally symmetrical, so like your face is bilaterally symmetrical, whereas a starfish is radially symmetrical most of the time. Anyway, so they're very common. Most of them grow with a basal arrangement of leaves, so leaves coming out of a single base, not coming up and branching on a stalk, although a couple do. They grow in great quantities in forest understories. You may find them as weeds in your garden. Really, they're just free flowers in your garden. And their flowers come in purples and whites and yellows, sometimes with a little bit of combination of any of those two colors. And their ecology is pretty interesting. So violets, the genus is Viola, they will produce flowers that are meant to be pollinated by insects, and then throughout the summer they'll produce flowers that actually self. So they don't open up, they self-pollinate, and so they reproduce asexually. And that means that they're not guaranteed, but they have a higher probability of reproducing successfully even if they don't get pollinated in a given year. Alrighty, so we're here with our first shrub of the day. In some places up in the Appalachian Mountains it grows to tree size, but in Connecticut it's really more of a shrub. And it's also the state flower, and that is mountain laurel. So this is an evergreen shrub with very, very distinctive oval-shaped leaves. They're simple, their margins are simple, so they don't have any teeth. They are evergreen, looks like the kind of thing you might put in a holiday wreath. And they have these clusters of very interesting flowers. Unfortunately, we're a little too early to look at the flowers themselves. Perhaps in a later video we'll look at fully open flowers and discuss the mechanism by which they pollinate, which is kind of interesting. But this plant is important because it's so ubiquitous in the forests of Connecticut, particularly in rocky uplands. You will find great thickets of mountain laurel. I don't know that it provides a great deal of food to animals, but it certainly provides a great deal of cover. And you'll often find it growing along with the oaks, chestnut oaks, red oaks, perhaps some hickories, but generally with a lot of oaks, which is really what we have in this forest here, is a lot of oaks and a lot of mountain laurel. Every single part of the plant is poisonous, toxic to human beings, so you shouldn't be eating it. I have read that it was used to make pipes. The burls of these plants were used to make pipes. I don't know why that worked out, but it does have interesting looking wood. It's kind of a darkish wood. It's very brittle, but also very tough. And you can see that it's got this really flaky bark with multiple layers of bark that's brown and flaky. This bark looks fairly similar to high bush blueberry, although high bush blueberry does not have evergreen leaves, so you shouldn't really confuse the two. And you're never going to find this kind of concentration of high bush blueberry. You'll find it on the edges of swamps and wetlands. But just try not to confuse the two, and try not to burn this wood. I have heard, I don't know if it's actually true, but I've heard that burning it can release toxic smoke, so be careful not to burn mountain laurel. So since we just did a state plant with the mountain laurel, our state flower, I figured we would stop at the state tree, which is the white oak. I believe it's the northern white oak is the common name, Quercus alba. So before we go into this particular tree, let's just talk about how we break down and help ourselves to identify the two different groups of white oak, two different groups of oaks that grow in the Northeast. So there are three groups of oaks that we classify in the world, but in the Northeast we have two main groups, the white oak group and the red oak group. So the red oak group has leaves that have pointy lobes to them. So the lobes, each of these things is a lobe, have little points at the ends of them. And so when I teach this to kids, I like to tell them, think of the red oak group as the fire group. We've got fiery little tips on each of the lobes. Whereas the white oak group has leaves that have rounded lobes. You can see the rounded lobes here. And so those kind of look like clouds. They're rounded like clouds. You've never seen a pointy cloud. Maybe you have, but most of the time you don't. So the white oak group reminds us of clouds. So anyways, what we have here, if we were looking at this tree and we were curious what it was, we'd see that we had the rounded lobes, which indicate we're looking at a white oak group individual. And then of the white oak group species in the area, in the uplands, we're most likely to find northern white oak. There's a swamp white oak, but it's much less common, grows down in the swamps, and it doesn't have these deep lobes in the leaves. The bark of the white oak is pretty distinctive once it gets large. When oaks are small, they tend to be a little bit harder to tell apart. But it starts off, it is kind of white. With any color of bark in nature, you kind of have to suspend disbelief and go with very generalized colors. But it is kind of a whitish bark. We'll see that more with the adult behind us. But it's kind of a strippy bark. We see different smooth patches here, and then the formation of vertical strips. If we come over here and we look at this more mature, it's not a fully mature, but more mature white oak, we'll see that the bark has changed a little bit. And this is a general rule for any tree. When the tree is small, when it's a sapling, its bark is going to be very different than it is as it gets larger. So when you're trying to learn trees by their bark, you have to learn the different stages of each tree's bark. But this is pretty close to what it's going to look like when it gets to be very large. But what we have is vertical strips. They're very flat. They're tightly bound to the trunk. They have very shallow depressions in between them. So what we have here is a black birch. Betula lenta, I'm pretty sure. Black birch. So what we have here is a black birch. In the forests of Connecticut, where you have many oaks, you often either have also many hickories or many black birches. So this is one of the species that tends to grow in concert with oaks in uplands, rocky upland areas, not really down near the water necessarily. Now, if you look closely at this bark here, you'll see that birches in general tend to have lenticels. So lenticels are these horizontal streaks in the bark which are used for gas exchange. So lots of trees have lenticels. Some of them are more obvious than others, but birches in general have these really distinctive thin horizontal lenticels. They also tend to have bark that cracks and flakes in peels. White birch or paper birch and yellow birch make tremendous tinder, fire-making material in the woods. Black birch, not so much. You will see on really large examples of this tree some amount of peeling, but it peels in plates. They're not the kind of thing that you can pull off and crinkle up in your hands and use to make fire. So it's really not useful for fire making. So the leaves are pretty much just oval shaped, but they're serrated. So these little teeth that you see here are called serrations. And in fact, if you were to look closely enough, you would see that there are double serrations. So there are big serrations, big teeth, that are covered in little teeth. So we have these pretty simple looking oval-shaped serrated leaves. Notably, this tree has some confusing common names similar to some of the other plants we've talked about already. I'm calling it hop hornbeam. I think that's the most distinctive name. It can also be called ironwood. There's another short tree that has very similar leaves but very different bark that grows in these forests that is also sometimes called ironwood, but I prefer to call blue beech or musclewood because its wood looks like mussels. This tree tends to like fairly rich soils. Curiously, the presence of a lot of mountain laurel in this area suggests that the soil is probably fairly acidic. It likes fairly acidic soils. Hop hornbeam does really well in the same soils that white ash and sugar maple do well in. So soils that are more basic, they're not actually basic, but they're certainly not very acidic, and which have high concentrations of calcium and magnesium in the soil. So much more rich, nutrient-rich soils. But we're not seeing a lot of examples of this tree around us. We're not seeing any big examples, so that kind of suggests that this particular individual is a little bit of an outlier in this forest community. When this tree is really young, so if its diameter is similar to this twig right here, it's going to have quite similar bark to black birch. They're both going to have horizontal lenticels, and the bark is going to be fairly smooth. This is going to have a slightly reddish tinge to it, whereas the black birch is going to have more of a dark gray tinge to it. The real differences occur as the tree grows larger. So when trees get bigger, as I've said already, their bark transforms and it changes. And so instead of becoming big, slightly peeling gray plates that are otherwise sort of smooth, the way that black birch does, this forms vertical strips, kind of similar in their flakiness to the vertical strips of our white oak, but a much darker hue, almost a reddish hue. And this will, once it gets to be a large tree, will look fairly shaggy, though its shagginess will be much more uniform than, say, shagbark hickory, which is the shaggiest tree that we'll find in these forests. All right, so we're going to cover our first ferns of the day. People don't tend to know their ferns, either because they find learning ferns to be intimidating, or because perhaps they just assume there aren't that many ferns to be had. But in fact, there's many species of fern, and they're fairly interesting, and they're fairly important to the ecology of our forests. So we're going to introduce a couple ferns that are a little easier to learn in general. Unfortunately, ferns come with some specialized vocabulary, but we're going to give you a very light dosage of that vocabulary. So the first fern we're going to look at here is New York fern, which has one of the coolest scientific names that I know, Thelipteris novoboracensis, which is just, I don't know, just crazy. Who wanted to write that multiple times? But anyways, this fern can be identified from other ferns in the area generally by the overall shape of its blade. And so what you really want to notice with this fern is that the width of the overall blade is widest in the middle, and then it tapers at both ends to points. So it tapers all the way down to the base here. You'll see that the hay-scented fern, it tapers a little bit at its base, but not a great deal. The tapering is very, very dramatic with the New York fern. Now there are a couple other ferns in the region that will show this kind of tapering, but New York fern is the most common and the one you're most likely to see. Both of these grow in large groups, in large swaths. If you look over here, you can see that the hay-scented fern is actually covering much of the forest floor in our area. And in forests that are heavily inhabited by deer, overpopulated by deer, deer browse tends to beat back all the other plants, and because deer don't eat ferns, it gives a competitive advantage to hay-scented fern. Hay-scented fern is also really good at filling gaps in the canopy, so when we get tent caterpillar coming through, or gypsy moths, and they wipe out the canopy and potentially kill trees in the canopy, often those gaps will get dominated by hay-scented fern. And those fields of hay-scented fern are called fern deserts. They actually keep other plants from germinating and growing in the understory. So they're actually quite destructive. This is a native plant, though. New York fern, on the other hand, will form these large swaths of ferns, but it doesn't really create the same recalcitrant fern deserts that hay-scented fern does. And if you crinkle up the foliage and you smell your hands, or you smell the foliage, it should kind of smell like hay, which is pretty cool. as we've been looking at different trees so far today, I haven't mentioned branching. That's because all the trees we've looked at so far have alternate branching. Now, if you want to really get good at tree identification, one of the first breaks that you use to divide the two major groups of trees apart from each other and figure out which one you might be looking at is to divide them by their branching habit. So alternate or opposite branching. So what we have here is an example of opposite branching. We have two branches coming out of the stem directly opposite one another. Now there are only a few trees in New England that have opposite branching, whereas there are many trees that have alternate branching. So the opposite branching trees are the maples and the ashes and the dogwoods and viburnums, which are really shrubs, and the horse chestnuts, which you don't see much of anyway. So really it's the maples and the ashes. That's what you're going to think of when you see opposite branching trees. And so what we have here is an ash. Now we know it's an ash immediately because of its leaves. Maples have a single leaf. It's a single simple leaf, whereas this is a compound leaf. It is produced of many little leaflets. So this whole thing here is a leaf, and each of these little leaves is called a leaflet. So that's very different from what the maples have. They have an individual single leaf. The other thing that has this kind of a compound leaf around here are the hickories, of which we have four common species in Connecticut. Black walnut has compound leaves like this, and so does locust, black locust, and honey locust. But they look pretty different from this. So this type of a leaf looks fairly similar to what you see on a hickory. We're going to look at a hickory in a minute. But a hickory has alternate branching, and an ash has opposite branching. Anyways, so we've got these compound leaves. Telling the three ashes apart, the three species of ash in Connecticut, is fairly difficult. So this is almost certainly a white ash. We've also got green ash and black ash. Black ash tends to grow. The easiest way for people starting to do this, to ID the trees, is probably just to generalize based on habitat. So black ash tends to grow in swampy areas. It's a smaller tree. Green ash you'll often find on river floodplains, in areas that have been heavily disturbed by people, or in cities. It's a common tree for planting in cities. White ash is much more of a forest upland tree. It tends to grow on richer soils, so you'll tend to see it growing along with sugar maple, basswood, hop hornbeam. And it doesn't have much of a canopy. So this example here, its canopy is dead, but if you look at the canopy of a green ash, it's generally a pretty large canopy, pretty extensive, kind of drooping, whereas the canopy of a white ash is pretty constricted. It's really conserving the space that it uses up in the overall canopy mosaic that is made up of individual tree canopies. The bark of the white ash is kind of whitish. This example is a little rough because it's been degraded by decay, funguses, and the overall impact of having been infested with emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer is a beetle that is spreading throughout the eastern United States and wiping out the ashes. Mortality rates, I don't know exactly what they are, but they're very, very high. So most of our ashes will be dead soon, unfortunately. And we took a photo earlier of the emerald ash borer sign. It's this little D-shaped hole that they leave in the bark, specifically D-shaped. And then we get all this concomitant damage caused by woodpeckers that are going after all the emerald ash borers under what is eventually dead bark. And you'll see lots and lots of bark picked off the tree. We don't really have that here, but we do have an erosion of the bark. So here we've got some ridges that are still intact, and here we have ridges that have been flattened out a little bit because exterior chunks have come off. But the overall habit of the bark is to form these little diamonds. They're fairly deeply furrowed diamonds. And you will see this in both the white ash and in the green ash, though the green ash is a bit different, and you need to look at photos to kind of get the sense for that. We're not going to try and just describe it. And you'll also find these diamond patterns occurring in the hickories. So there's a lot of look-alike, a lot of similar appearances between the ashes and the hickories, but the main dividing difference is that opposite branching. So what we have here, we're going to take a little break from trees and ferns, and we're going to get back to our herbaceous plants. So this is a really cool plant that we found here, Indian cucumber root. So it's a very simple looking plant on the forest floor. It has a single whorl of leaves coming out from the top of a solitary stalk. Those leaves are going to be generally symmetric in size, and they're going to come out on an even plane. So they're not going to be coming out on different planes, they'll be on an even plane. And that's important because there's a look-alike for this called starflower. Now, starflower has really beautiful flowers, which Indian cucumber root doesn't really have super beautiful flowers. But Indian cucumber root has a special treat, which really you shouldn't partake in, other than maybe to try it once in your life. And that is a small root that is edible. Very small. It's like that small. So it tastes like cucumber. Everybody's had cucumber. And it's covered in dirt. So you really don't need to eat it. Maybe if the world ends and you're living off of things in the woods, you'll eat it and survive very, very poorly off of it. But there's really no need to dig it up and eat it. Anyways, when this does flower, what it's going to do is it's going to put up a second stalk. And really this is only going to happen with really mature, healthy, large plants. So this plant can get probably about that much bigger in overall diameter. It'll put up a second stalk with a second whorl of leaves, much smaller, and then out of that whorl will hang several green little pretty simple flowers that'll just hang down. So that's the flowering sort of strategy of this plant. I don't really know how to generalize where I see it. I feel like in wetter soils in the woods, and generally in little clumps, you'll see a lot of it coming up. A minor food source for a very, very desperate survivalist if you need it, but really, really cool plant. So what we have here is one of the easier ferns for you to learn and identify without needing to develop more technical fern skills. This is cinnamon fern. And so the cinnamon part of the name comes from this stalk here. This is called a fertile frond. So it's a frond that it has pinnae. These things are pinnae, these photosynthetic appendages. But instead of pinnae that are photosynthesizing, they're all pinnae that are just covered in sori. And sori are these little packets of spores that the fern uses to reproduce. So these pinnae are not being used for photosynthesis, they're bearing forth all of these little sori. And if you look really closely at it, it's really quite interesting. I would describe them as analogous to little spider babies just coming out of a spider egg sac. But from a distance, it really kind of just looks like a stick of cinnamon. Now, if the cinnamon stick isn't here, it's going to be harder to tell that this is truly cinnamon fern. It loves wet environments. You will find it growing under more dry forest canopy in the uplands, but it's never going to be reproducing. It's always going to be stunted and small. This is even a very small example, and that's because we're next to a stream, but we're not really in a thick wetland right now, a really developed wetland. So we don't have a particularly beefy example. But on the edges of ponds and bogs, or on the edges of bogs, on the edges of bigger streams and brooks, you'll find a much bigger, more impressive examples of these. So we've got Solomon seal here growing on top of a rock inside the ravine of the Ravine Trail. Really cool plant. The thing is that there's a ton of lookalikes for Solomon seal. And people do grow it in their gardens. You can buy it at your garden center. But these individuals here are just doing incredibly well. Usually under the forest canopy, they look more like this. little guy down here, they don't do very well. But this patch is just, for whatever reason, doing remarkably well. And you can see that it has these little flowers that hang down like little bells underneath each leaf. In this case in pairs, often in individual flowers. And there's many different lookalikes for Solomon seal that we won't go into right now. But it tends to be the bane of many folks who are trying to identify this species in the woods because there's so many lookalikes. So we're reaching the end of our walk here, and we've made it into the ravine. We're not going to show you the whole ravine. You'll have to come out here to walk through it and see it for yourself. But I just wanted to sort of review some of the habitats that we've walked through today. So we started off at the head of the trail in sort of a dry upland oak and mountain laurel dominated forest with a relatively species poor understory when you consider or compare it with the ravine itself. It's a really dramatic ravine where we've got granite boulders all over the place, covered in moss. We've got water running, some of it more regular than others. And because we have this broken up topography and geology, it's possible that there are more heterogeneous flows of nutrients coming out of the minerals around this ravine. There's also areas with less canopy cover. So where we are right here, there's a decent amount of canopy, but a little further down there are areas of old dead hemlocks that were wiped out by the woolly adelgid. So those canopy gaps are bringing in a lot of light. So the mixture of increased moisture, increased light, and potentially a more heterogeneous supply of nutrients have created a much more species-rich community in this ravine. So this ravine is an incredible place. If you're interested in learning how to identify more plants or botanize, you should come here and explore it and see all the wonderful plants that it has to offer.